The late criminologist David Rowe was one of the leaders in the movement to bring the discussion of biology back to criminal justice, which occurred in the late 1990s. Prior to this, biological and individual trait theories had widely been ignored by criminologists. Today, they are certainly influential, and to a large degree, this is due to Rowe, who published a groundbreaking book titled Biology and Crime in 2002. The article presented in the Colin and Agnew book is a segment of Rowe's book. In this work, Rowe contends that genetic factors affect individual traits through their impact on the central nervous system and autonomic nervous system. He argues that there is a physiological basis of criminal disposition, and there is evidence that criminals may have deficits in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Also, Rowe contends that there is an association between low serotonin levels and violence. He controlled for various factors such as social class and drug use, and still found that low serotonin levels were found in violent, antisocial individuals. Additionally, individuals with low heart rates were more prone to violence. According to Rowe, this has been found in both American and English populations. It is possible that individuals with low heartbeats and low serotonin levels engage in violence and other forms of aggressive, risk-taking behavior in an attempt to raise their serotonin and heart rates, perhaps trying to feel normal. In his work, Rowe also argued that there is an association between weak skin conductance and criminal disposition. He measured skin conductance by examining how much the fingers sweat. Also, Rowe argues that if individuals have a lack of fear, they may seek out stimulating situations, which could include crime. After all, crime is exciting, which could explain the popularity of television shows such as Law and Order or CSI or Criminal Minds. Rowe also looks at the prefrontal lobes of the brain and contends that murderers often have less brain activity in the prefrontal areas of the brain. He suggests that murderers may also have less nerve cells in this region of the brain, which is something I find very interesting as I study and teach serial murder. Rowe does acknowledge that the environment influences traits. In fact, he contends that biological harms may be a function of the social environment. For example, if a child is exposed to toxins, poor prenatal care, poverty, or abuse, this may affect his or her mind and cause dysfunctions in the brain. So in essence, a combination of biological factors and a poor social environment make criminal behavior more likely than having one alone. I think Rowe's work is very important, and even though he's no longer with us, he has gone on to influence a new wave of biocriminologists. Some of these are very young scholars who've never even met Rowe but have been influenced by his work. I would now like to turn to Sheldon and Ellen Gluck's work, Unraveling Juvenile Delinquency. This is an example of a longitudinal research study which was published as a monograph in 1950. At the time, some sociologists rejected this work, saying that it was flawed methodologically and portrayed offenders as biologically deficient. In 1993, however, Robert Sampson and John Lobb reanalyzed the data in an effort to overcome many of the initial criticisms. Since then, the Gluck's work has been viewed as an important development in biocriminology. In their book, the Glukes argued that theories of crime should focus on more than sociological factors, and they called for a multi-factor or an eclectic approach. In the first part of their work, the Glukes examined the physique of delinquents, and they found that delinquents were more likely than non-delinquents to have mesomorphic or solid muscular bodies. And the Glukes also argued that delinquents are more likely to be extroverts as well as more assertive. Also, delinquents were more likely than non-delinquents to have less verbal intelligence. By the way, it is important to look at the methodology that the Glukes used. They compared a sample of 500 institutionalized boys with a sample of 500 non-delinquent boys, and then they used matching techniques to ensure that both groups were similar demographically. And then they looked for major differences between the two groups and followed up with the boys at ages 25 and 32. And this is an example of longitudinal research, which is obviously time-consuming. We can only hope they had other projects going on while they were doing this. As you might imagine, the authors found that delinquents were more likely to misbehave in school, and when they did, the misbehavior usually occurred at about 3 years before it occurred in non-delinquents. The Glukes also examined other socio-cultural factors, and they found that the biosocial legacy of the parents of delinquents was consistently poorer than non-delinquents. For example, a higher proportion of delinquents' parents suffered from serious physical ailments, were mentally retarded or emotionally disturbed. Overall, this work was very important because it assigned special importance to biological and psychological factors while discounting the importance of social factors, at least to a degree. The authors argued that social factors were important but did not have a causal effect the way biological and psychological factors did. And this is a very, very bold assertion considering the time period, 1950, when sociological theories dominated criminal justice. Also, this is a developmental theory which illustrates that early antisocial behavior is related to later criminal behavior. The Glukes' work is, in my opinion, regarded today as a classic in the discipline. Let us now turn to another individual trait theory, which also happens to be a life developmental theory as well. Terry Moffat's groundbreaking study of life course persistent antisocial behavior appeared in 1993 in the journal Psychological Review. In her article, Moffat contends that life course persistent offending may be related to abnormal brain development, which may occur through pre- or postnatal exposure to drugs, poor nutrition, or injury, among other factors. And Moffat also argues that problems in the central nervous system may have a negative impact on psychological characteristics such as temperament, behavioral development, and cognitive abilities. She argues quite convincingly that neuropsychological defects are linked to misconduct and social failure throughout one's life. Interestingly, Moffat does not discount environmental factors. For example, she argues that on top of neuropsychological defects, these children are often not born into wealthy, intact families. Parents may share some of these defects, and they may lack the resources to handle what they perceive to be a difficult child. And this may in turn lead to harsh or lax disciplinary measures, which are not likely to help reform the child. And one of the most interesting aspects of her article Moffat goes on to explain the difference between adolescents, limited, and life course persistent offenders. Adolescent limited offenders are delinquents who only engage in a few acts of delinquency during their teenage years. We know that based on self-report data, most teenagers engage in acts of delinquency. But Moffat argues that adolescents' limited delinquency occurs in groups, whereas life course persistent delinquents often act alone. Interestingly, though, she argues that life course persistent offenders may often become popular in school and may even be role models for adolescent limited offenders. Of course, most delinquents age out of crime. As they reach adulthood, the maturity gap closes and the consequences of crime escalate. So most adolescent limited offenders desist from crime. There are exceptions. For example, there may be a youth who began offending as an adolescent limited offender. However, he or she may become involved in serious drug use, which could in fact lead to a criminal career. This, I think, is a tragedy, but it is true that some juveniles who only intend to experiment with delinquency may actually become trapped into crime. And policymakers realize this, which is probably why we probably have limited sanctions for most juvenile offenders. In her article, Moffat also contends that some juveniles do not experiment with crime at all. And she argues that these individuals may have personalities that make them unattractive to other teens. And since juvenile offending tends to be a group phenomenon, these individuals may simply be excluded from delinquency. I suppose this is a good thing, but Moffat almost seems to imply that these non-delinquents may have something wrong with them since they are essentially rejected by their peers. To me, Moffat's work is very interesting because it illustrates that there are essentially two groups of juvenile delinquents. There are adolescent limited offenders who offend in groups and desist around the time they graduate from high school. And then there are the life course persistent offenders. Moffat argues that it is the life course offenders who are likely to have neuropsychological problems that may begin before they are even born. They may be born addicted to drugs, which disrupts their brain functioning, and in turn, they are often viewed as difficult infants once they are born, and as problem children as they grow older. And of course, the vicious cycle continues, and it may repeat itself well into adulthood. Moffat considers life course persistent antisocial behavior to be pathological. And while her work appeared initially in a psychological journal, criminologists noticed Moffat's work, and it was and still is a very influential article.